what are the 5 policies that we're definitely going to do that we think will make the biggest difference? Banning mobile phones would easily be in my top 5. There's a huge mismatch between teachers and indeed students often think good teaching and learning looks like and what the evidence actually suggests. One of the biggest misconceptions that exists when it comes to studying is often people think you do a lot of learning and then you do a quiz at the end to assess how much you've learned. But the quiz doesn't just assess how much you learned, the quiz accelerates how much you learn. Like the quiz is part of the learning process. That is the key of facilitating that transfer from working memory, which we know is really, really short, to long-term memory, which is really, really large. Cold calling is a way of showing not only do I expect everyone to be listening, not only do I expect everyone to be thinking, but also just from a motivation aspect, you belong in my setting. I care what you think. I absolutely feel that there is gold in the research. There is research out there that I think can be transformative in education and students' lives. We have an issue with AI research. It's almost a bit outdated before it's even published. So I think it's not a bad performance tool. As a learning tool, as of yet, big question marks. And this is the thing, it's just human cognitive architecture. It's how our brains are designed. That is the core of the science of learning for me.
Welcome to Trust Matters Lessons in Leadership. In this episode, we're joined by Bradley Busch, a chartered psychologist and director of InnerDrive. Bradley began his career working with elite footballers and Olympic athletes, helping them perform under intense pressure. Today, he works with teachers and school leaders, applying the same principles of psychology, motivation, and high performance to the classroom. We explore why so much educational research fails to reach the people who need it the most, and how InnerDrive was built to bridge that gap between teachers and research. Bradley explains why humans are often poor judges of what good learning looks like, and how that mismatch plays out in everyday classroom practice, from revision strategies students love but don't actually work, to the activities teachers design in good faith but that don't always stick. In this episode, we dig into some of the most hotly debated issues in schools today, including the impact of mobile phones, the promise and risk of AI in learning, and what cognitive science really says about music, distraction, and focus. Bradley also shares practical insight into how small changes to classroom design, lesson structure, and task design can make a surprisingly big difference to the way that students learn and remember. Finally, we look at the bigger picture. How do we build genuinely independent learners, and how can we assess pupils fairly in a world of projects, coursework, and exams? And what should every teacher understand about working memory, long-term memory, and the science of learning? This is a thoughtful, practical, and eye-opening conversation about how research, when translated well, can transform classrooms and help schools create learning that truly lasts. Welcome to the podcast, Brad. Such a pleasure for you to join us today.
Thank you.
You started training, well, how would you put it when you were working with elite sports people? Because I think it's a nice story for the background here.
Okay, yeah. So, well, thanks for having me. My background, I think, is probably a bit different to most people in education. So, I trained as a sports psychologist. I did my research thesis when I was at university was on fear of failure in youth footballers and how they cope with stress. And so I started working sport mainly either in football or with like Paralympic and Olympic athletes. And so I did that for the first part of my career and I loved it. And at the time, the big focus was around how do we help athletes perform under pressure? So this was around London 2012 and very much teaching athletes the sort of skills I think students need for exam nerves. Mm-hmm. So managing doubt and worry and being able to demonstrate ability, essentially. And in the build up to the 2016 Rio Games, kind of had a bit of a shift. And a big focus of what we were doing in the sports world then was around how do we help our athletes learn better? So can we go to the same number of competitions, have the same number of days as our competitors, but just learn at a faster rate? And so I really started then focusing on the science of learning. And my job in the team was to look at how do we then use some of that research from science of learning to improve performance. And all the research I was looking at was from educational psychology. Almost none of it came from sports psychology. And I did that and I really loved it and it was really fun. Some of the work I did in football, working with some amazing athletes, so like from Man United and Man City.
I was going to say, I feel like you got a name drop because...
What's nice, we're not really allowed to talk about individuals, though I'd love to.
Yeah.
We can talk about their teams.
Yeah.
And so I love doing that stuff, but ultimately we at InnerDrive just felt teaching millionaire footballers how to kick a ball better wasn't really going to change the world. We thought we could have more of a positive dent in the universe by working in education. And I think we got lucky. It coincided with, a lot of people in England wanting to be more evidence-informed in education. And so we kind of made the step there about 15 years ago and never really looked back.
And you've called it the Google Translate for research, InnerDrive. How would you describe it? So what do you do? How does it work in education now? And what have you set up there?
Yeah, okay. So, we call, kind of tongue-in-cheek, we call InnerDrive Google Translate for research because, genuinely, I absolutely feel that there is gold in the research. There is research out there that I think can be transformative in education and students' lives, but just get really frustrated that it's behind paywalls. It's often really inaccessible. So written very psych jargon heavy language. And the kind of awkward truth for me is most educational research isn't written for teachers. It's actually written for other researchers and academics. And we just felt that, so we don't do research ourselves, but we just felt in InnerDrive, if we could be that translate, we're not going to tell people how to teach, because I don't think research can do that so prescriptively. But if we can go, here are the main findings, here are the general principles that are emerging, how do you think you can apply that to your practice? Teachers love talking about their craft and they love talking about pedagogy and they're passionate about how they can help students. And yet they don't often have as much time as we'd ideally like in the world for them to be able to read the research themselves. And so we try and act as hopefully an unbiased middle man or third party that can just make this stuff accessible and illuminate some of the key findings so that teachers can figure out what to do with it.
And like you say, I think with research, it can be quite restrictive in the sense that it can be really long, behind paywalls, and it's hard when teachers are already time poor for them to spend their time going through that, taking out the main lessons. What are some of the biggest mismatches you see because of this between what is best practice in research around memory and learning and what's actually happening in classrooms at the moment?
Yeah, well, I guess there's kind of two main things to kind of flag. The first is research in psych labs is clean. Whereas the real world and especially classrooms and student, life is messy and complicated. So you have this mismatch slightly between what the research suggests is good, but that would never work in practice. So that's one thing to kind of navigate. The other thing I think is generally, I think when it comes to teaching and learning, it's one of the most counterintuitive things that exists on the planet. There's a huge mismatch between what teachers and indeed students often think good teaching and learning looks like and what the evidence actually suggests. So if we focus on teachers to start with as an example, a recent study a few years ago looked at, they got teachers to estimate how long do you think working memory lasts for? Now, bearing in mind, working memory is a fundamental part of the learning process. Over 50% of those surveyed got that answer wrong. They overestimated how long people can hold information in their mind for. The reality is it's only a few seconds. So if you've got sometimes teachers who have that misunderstanding, if you then have got students and parents who have a misunderstanding around what good studying looks like pretty much every study you can find, when you give students a choice of what do they think good learning looks like, they always choose the wrong thing. So cramming last minute instead of spacing it out your work, studying to music, blocking versus interleaving, which is kind of mixing up the topics, rereading, highlighting, they tend to love, and yet it tends to be the least effective. So we know students do what they like and what they prefer, as opposed to what's best for them. So my kind of tongue-in-cheek a bit comparison is my 7-year-old. He loves chocolate chip cookies for breakfast. That's what he wants for breakfast. But I know that's not what's best for him. So we have this interesting dynamic in education where we have this moral obligation to do what's best for people as educators, but it might not be what their short-term preference is. And I think research can help us navigate that because it can challenge our assumptions, it can challenge our biases, and it can highlight what might be counterintuitive.
And you speak about revision there, and I think that's one of those things that I remember when I was a student, like revision hacks, revision tips, those are the things you always want to unlock, because how can you make something that can be so vast a lot easier and make exams easier for you? Yeah. And I know for myself, I loved highlighting, doing the notes, making them smaller. And I think people always asking what are the best ways to do that. So if you were speaking to a group of year 11s now and saying before your GCSEs in the summer, these are some of the things that you should actually be doing that actually works, what would those top revision tips be?
Yeah. So what's funny is we get asked this question all the time. This is what we literally do. We go into schools and we do these trainings with students and staff. I guess the interesting thing for me is like, we know those answers. Like, it's out there in the research, and it's not even by a small margin. There are huge differences. So kind of what you were describing, the most common ones we typically see are highlighting. I think often that gives like the illusion of learning, makes you feel good because you get to go, look, I've highlighted all these things. They're in different colors, they're different sections. Maybe that's a good starting point. Most evidence suggests when you close that book, students don't remember the highlighted passages more. Likewise, rereading. So reading is obviously a really important thing to encourage. It's associated with a whole range of benefits. But when reading is the beginning, the middle, and the end of someone's learning, it becomes problematic for the simple reason, and you can tell me if you've had this. Have you ever had it when you've been reading for ages, and after a while, you can say, oh yeah, I've turned the pages in the last 5 minutes, but I can't actually tell you anything I've actually read.
I tell you, every time I start a new book on my Kindle, I get like 10 pages in and I'm like, I actually don't think I've read any of that.
Right. And this is the interesting thing because it's easy to skim read. It's easy to highlight on autopilot. The whole challenge is really getting people to think hard, to mentally engage and to wrestle with the content. And certain strategies prompt that more than others. So, for example, having students quiz themselves is really powerful. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that exists when it comes to studying is often people think you do a lot of learning and then you do a quiz at the end to assess how much you've learned. But the quiz doesn't just assess how much you learned, the quiz accelerates how much you learn. Like the quiz is part of the learning process. And so highlighting certain strategies like that, getting people to self-reflect on what they do, and actually, is it just because I like it or is it because it's best for me? That, I think, is the key starting point.
And when you speak about working memory and how short it is, can you just explain a little bit more about the different types of memory and how they're unlocked in the classroom?
Sure. So this is probably going to be an oversimplification. We know the brain is completely messy and complex and nuanced. When people talk about like working memory or long-term memory, I think it's really important to acknowledge like this is not a part of your brain. Like there isn't like a working memory box and a long-term memory box. It's kind of a model that allows you to visualize how the process might works. So working memory is where new information is held and processed. Take this conversation as an example. If I, over the course of this chat, talk about 3 new studies that you've never heard of before, the first place you hold that information is in your working memory. And so you hold it and you kind of juggle and you kind of figure out what to do a bit with it. The real aim for me of teaching and learning is to get stuff in long-term memory. I can get anything in your working memory by you just hearing my voice. What I'm really interested in is after we have this chat, in a week's time or in a month's time, are you going to remember the stuff? Because if you are, you can think critically about it. You can think creatively with it. You can build on that knowledge and critique it. You can only do those things if it's in long-term memory. You can't do those things if it's in working memory. So then the challenge for us as educators becomes, how do I get stuff from your working memory into your long-term memory? And the general concept is the harder we think about stuff, the more likely that transfer is to happen. The famous quote that gets used all the time in this area is the quote like, memory is the residue of thought. And it gets said all the time because it just captures the essence of, if you don't think hard about stuff, you're unlikely to remember it. And so therefore, your Kindle example, you're not thinking hard about those 10 pages, so chances are you won't remember it. Whereas if I gave you a quiz on it, if I asked you to explain it to me, if I got you to compare it to something else, all of a sudden then your brain, you can already feel it, you're starting to go, okay, now I need to think harder with that material. That is the key of facilitating that transfer from working memory, which we know is really, really short, to long-term memory, which is really, really large. One of my favorite examples of this, so you can demonstrate working memory is really small. If I ask you, what did you have for lunch last Thursday? Like, there's almost no way you're going to remember that, right? If I ask you now, I'll put you on the spot here.
Oh, right. Yeah. I'm like, get it right.
So if I ask you either like, what was your favorite TV program as a child, or what was the most popular song in your teenage years? Like, I can remember watching the cartoon Banana Man from 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I know every word in the song Gangster's Paradise.
Yeah.
Because when I went to school disco, that was really popular like 20 or 30 years ago. And that's because that stuff's in my long-term memory.
It's really funny you say that, because a friend of mine sent me a song the other day,
Right.
and it was a song we always used to sing in year 7, which is God knows how many years ago now. And I was like, how do I still remember every word, but I can't remember what I was doing yesterday? Like, and I was like, is that me getting old? But I guess it is the memory thing of
and this is the thing, it's just human cognitive architecture. It's how our brains are designed, and therefore we can tap into that. And therefore, we can start thinking about, well, what can I then do to help students get stuff in their long-term memory? That is the core of the science of learning for me.
And when you look at that in a classroom setting, because I guess the argument would be, if I got 30 kids in a class, how am I going to be able to do the long-term memory part of that? Like, I can't be constantly doing quizzes. I can't be making all these new ways for them to remember. What are some of the things that you speak to teachers about? Like, these are some of the ways that you can make it work in your classroom.
Sure. So I should say that I think there are some general principles. How it actually looks in the classroom can vary massively, because how this stuff looks in maths might be really different in French. How it looks for 7-year-old students is really different for 18-year-olds. So this is where teacher judgment, I think, plays a really key part. But there are some principles. So let's take one as an example. How a teacher not ask questions, but how they actually go about getting an answer. So 2 schools of thought. The more old school traditional thought would be if you do self-selection. So self-selection is, I ask a question. You can choose to put your hand up or not. And if you put your hand up, then the psychological contract there is, I'll come to you if you have your hand up. I won't come to you if you have your hand down. Now, the problem with self-selection is it tends to benefit the loudest or the quickest or the most knowledgeable in the class. But for some other students, they know if they don't put their hand up, they're never going to be asked a question. So therefore, they don't have to think hard. So if you look at some of the research, the opposite of self-selection is referred to as cold calling. Cold calling being, you can still put your hand up, but I retain the right to ask anyone to answer the question. Sometimes phrased as like, it's an invitation to join the discussion. And by doing that, you know you're on the hook, essentially. So therefore, you need to pay attention and you need to be thinking. What's really fascinating for me is the research shows which group of students benefits the most from this sort of cold calling. It's those who are typically drowned out by their louder and quicker peers. Which group is that? Shy girls. So you almost have this like equality aspect of it. Like, actually, everyone should have the benefit of thinking hard. Everyone should get this retrieval bonus, if you like. And cold calling is a way of showing, not only do I expect everyone to be listening, not only do I expect everyone to be thinking, but also just from a motivation aspect, you belong in my setting. I care what you think. And it's not just for them, but it's for everyone. And so just tweaks like that are ways, if we start with the lens of how do I get everyone thinking hard, well, pretty quickly, self-selection becomes a pretty poor strategy then.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, actually, because I can remember from my own school experience, if I was in a classroom where I knew the teacher was someone who would just say your name, or like anyone at any point, you're like, okay, I need to engage because I don't want to embarrass myself if it comes to me and I'm like, oh, I've not actually been listening for the last 10 minutes.
And this is where it gets generally really interesting, because there's quite a bit of nuance here. So if you speak to some of the researchers around this area, one thing they say is, so cold calling works well if you're calling on someone who you think has a good chance of getting it right. So I'm not trying to embarrass someone. I'm not trying to pick on them. I'm trying to use this as an opportunity to draw them in. It shows it gets better over time. So one of the seminal studies on this shows that if you do mainly self-selection, typically about half the class will volunteer an answer, will choose to participate. And it's really interesting how the unwritten rules get established. So the students quickly work out, we're the ones who participate and we're the ones who don't. And if you don't participate, you know it's basically a game of chicken. Can you just hold your nerve and not put your hand up and embrace the awkwardness, and therefore you won't have to think hard. Whereas the research shows when you do this sort of cold calling, but in a really warm and nurturing and consistent way, they found within about, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks in the study, almost 90% of the students wanted to participate. It became the norm. Not only did it improve their confidence in participating, but improve their competence as well. And so that sort of stuff is where I think the science of learning can generally be quite magic. It can be transformational.
And to pivot a little bit here, there's quite a few big debates in education at the moment. And I feel like maybe research might help us with some of the things, the myths, facts, etc. Mobile phones. One of the most hotly debated topics in education for the last 5 years. And I mean, it's probably only going to get more and more popular in terms of the debate. But What does the research actually say about the use of mobile phones amongst the generation who are at school? How does it impact learning? How does it impact memory? And how should that inform schools' policy on mobile phones
Yeah.
in schools?
So I think if I had a blank piece of paper and I was starting a school from scratch, and you can go like, what are the 5 policies that we're definitely going to do that we think will make the biggest difference? Banning mobile phones would easily be in my top 5. I think the research is now overwhelming. And you can look at it from a few different angles. So if you talk about academic grades, so one of the most famous studies in England looked at what happened when schools ban mobile phones and what happens on GCSE grades. And they found there was a significant bump in GCSE grades. And what's really interesting, if you look into like the devil in the detail of like the findings, the group that got the biggest advantage from mobile phones being banned, who made the most improvements in their GCSEs, were students who were historically struggling in school or from disadvantaged backgrounds. So they're the ones who have the most to gain. This sort of research is mirrored. You see studies, I've read studies in America, China, Brazil, Spain, all of them pointing to the same direction, that you tend to get a boost in grades. So that's the one hand. So you can make the argument just purely on an academic basis. Then you can look at all the other studies that look at the pastoral side of things. So well-being tends to improve. Rates of bullying are reported that they get reduced. It makes safeguarding so much easier. And then I guess the third thing I'd finally say, so we've got the academics, we've got the pastoral side of things, is this is one of the things I actually think you don't actually need research on. We work with a lot of schools. A lot of them have introduced mobile phone bans. I don't know one of them who've done the ban and gone, we should reverse that. That was a bad decision. Every single one of them that I know has said, it's a nicer place to teach. They feel students are doing more learning. Just the stuff that sometimes research can't quantify, how the children are playing at break time has shifted, the type of conversations that students have. And what's really interesting is when you speak to school leaders about this, it mirrors the research findings, is they say parents actually want it. Students actually want it. Like most students know their relationship with their phone is unhealthy and they value that space at school where they're not obligated essentially to be on. So for me, I just think it's a complete no-brainer. I actually think in about 10 or 15 years' time, people will look back, and they're already starting to, but I think in 10 or 15 years' time, it'll take a bit of time, people will look back and go, it's almost the equivalent of how people used to view smoking. Like they'll go, it was mad that it was so mainstream. Maybe this is me showing my age a bit here, but I remember when we had a family computer, there were certain rules around the family computer that, it was downstairs, it was for a limited time, and, it was of course standard that my parents would know what I was going on. And yet somehow it's shifted now, and it's become very mainstream and normalized that students will have their phone on them all the time. They have often unregulated access, even next to them when they sleep. So schools can be a safe haven. The final thing, if I'm not going on too much, this is one of my things I find.
This is...
is we shouldn't call them mobile phones. Like, it's just a nonsense phrase, if I'm being honest, because then most of the time they're not using them to make phone calls.
Yeah, so true.
Like, if you look at what the research actually says, how do most older teenagers, for example, use their phone? Social media, gaming, porn. As people get older, gambling. When you frame it like that, it's almost weird that we think that they would have a place in schools. And schools ban stuff all the time. We ban alcohol, we ban smoking. This idea that, because they're going to experience phones outside of school, we need to expose them to more bad stuff in the school. I think it's just such a flawed argument.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that about your experience with the internet, because we're obviously slightly different generation.
Sure.
But mine was the exact same, and that shows how fast it's changed.
Yeah. Because
when I was in school, we had a family computer. It was a room in the house downstairs. You got an hour on it after school. My parents knew exactly what I was doing, and I think that just shows how quickly things have changed, and also the internet has opened wider than ever. I mean, we'll move on to AI as well, but the impact of that, and I feel like it's just accelerated at a pace that probably schools couldn't keep up with. And like you say, we'll look back on this time and think, what, it was weird that it wasn't just banned. It wasn't a thing that happened straight away.
And within that, we should acknowledge as well, the internet is different now to what it even was 5 years ago. So the best description I ever heard of it is from a teacher. He has a podcast, guy called Adam Boxer. So on his podcast, I think it's the best I don't know what the metaphor, simile. He basically said, so the comparison for the internet when it started was a web. So it's the World Wide Web. It can connect people and ideas, and that was amazing. Whereas he says it's no longer a web. It's actually more of a cocoon now. People get wrapped and trapped in the algorithm, and the algorithm is different now to what it was 5 years ago. And so I do think we have this kind of moral duty, this safeguarding emphasis to not have students unregulated use of this thing that is so different now to what it was 5 years ago. And if you look at the stats, when students first encounter hardcore pornography, the amount of students, I can't remember the exact number, I think it's about 50% who've seen a beheading video before they were 13. It's huge. And what's interesting, they don't go searching for these things. The algorithm brings it to them. And I think once you frame it like that, I'd be amazed if we're having the same conversation in 5 or 10 years.
And in the research, I mean, it could be how long is a piece of string, but is there an age that people say is appropriate for people to start to have access to the internet and a phone? And is there a sort of optimum time?
So I guess we have to acknowledge people do sometimes need phones. They do play a role when society is different. Parents need to maybe be in more contact. Students may travel further distance to get to schools now that families often live not necessarily as near perhaps as they did to certain schools. Parents' working patterns have changed. So I'm not completely anti-phones. In terms of when would someone get unregulated access to the internet, so smartphones, I think the question is when are you, the moment you're happy for them to be accessing extreme content. So I know there's a lot of talk in the research now about trying to make that to 16. Wouldn't surprise me if it ends up being 18 within a few years.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And alongside mobile phones and the internet, AI, I mean, the buzzword of the moment, but it has a massive impact on education.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we first started to hear it around, students using ChatGPT to help them with their homework or with their essays. And I mean, I've even heard of some unis now on the course, it's open, you can use ChatGPT during your exams because, like you said, similar to mobile phones, there's an argument to say if someone's using it in their working life, outside of it, we should embrace it. We should teach kids how to use it. What does the research say about the impact of AI? Because another thing I saw, and again, you don't know what's real on the internet, but it was around the grey matter in the brain when someone's using AI.
I saw that
And I mean, I'm not sure if it was legit or not, but I mean, there's got to be a lot of studies about how it impacts memory and learning. And what are you seeing?
So I think there are some really good opportunities, I think, especially for adults. So how adults use it as part of their day-to-day work, I certainly use it in mine. I expect you to use it in yours. I would certainly expect teachers and schools to think about where are the opportunities to use AI. So, for example, there have been some studies, it's still early days, suggesting it may, if used well, potentially be able to assist with stuff like lesson planning. I've seen some studies that suggest it may, if used well, in some situations, potentially be helpful for feedback. So there clearly are some potential benefits. If we park that to one side for one moment and talk about how students are using it, I guess the key thing to think about is students' brains are still forming. And if we go back to what we said earlier, the underlying principle of cognitive science is I want them to think hard about the material. So can we use AI to help you think hard about the material? Now, of course, in theory, we can. I can get it to ask me questions. If we look at the reality of how motions are actually using it, 2 studies come to mind. The first study, I guess before I talk about the 2 studies, I want to get my big caveat in, okay? Good research takes 12 to 18 months to produce because you have to get ethical approval, get the data, do your write-up, and then it gets peer-reviewed. And that's a good thing that it takes 12 to 18 months. What that means, when you're looking at studies, say, on memory and retrieval, I'm okay with that lag time because your brain isn't going to change too much in the last 2 years. So it's kind of, that data is still relevant. We have an issue with AI research. Because AI technology is improving so quickly, even within a year, the research that we get is often done on old versions of stuff like, say, ChatGPT. So it's almost a bit outdated before it's even published. That's a problem for us in the research type world. That being said, here's what we know. 2 studies I think are particularly interesting. The first one of the only randomized controlled trials I've actually seen on AI with student learning. So just for the avoidance of doubt, randomized controlled trial is you have one group do one thing, you have another group that does the exact same stuff, but you just change one thing, right? And this is usually seen as the gold standard of research, right? So one of the only randomized controlled trials I've seen on student learning, one group did their revision and their studying as normal, and then they did their final exam without and need ChatGPT. The second group could use ChatGPT during revision, and then they did their final exam as normal, again without ChatGPT. And what they found during the revision period, those who had access to ChatGPT were doing better, but when it came to their exam, those who used ChatGPT did worse. Now, why might this be the case? We don't know for sure. One of the things that the researchers highlighted in this study is the most common prompt that students were using in this experiment, in the study, was they were asking ChatGPT, tell me the answer. So like, when was the Battle of Hastings?
Yeah.
What is the answer to this equation? So of course, when you then do a quiz during that study period, you can basically do really well. But because it wasn't really prompting them to think hard, actually they did worse than those without ChatGPT. So that's a pretty big concern. The second study, the one you referred to about the grey matter one, so that was done by MIT fairly recently, and made big headlines basically saying that, like, you know, there's this cognitive debt and that it was changing their brains. I actually find the neuroscience part of that study the least interesting part of it. I know people like brain scans, and
Yeah.
like we know from research as well, like that captures people's attention.
Yeah.
The key part for me in that study was they compared the two groups: students who use ChatGPT essentially and those who didn't, to help them write their essay. And I think it was about an hour after they submitted their essay, they asked the students, "Can you quote one sentence from your essay?" And those who used ChatGPT, I think it was 83% of them couldn't even quote one sentence. Literally had gone from their memory. It was literally never there. A bit like your Kindle example from earlier, right? That is kind of in line with that other study. Is if we're using it to replace our thinking, that's really problematic. Whereas you, as an adult, as a professional, you've gone through your formative years. You have your schema in place of how the world works. So therefore, you can use it to aid your performance. So I think it's not a bad performance tool. As a learning tool, as of yet, big question marks. I have seen some studies, even within the last week, that look at AI as a tutoring tech tool, showing good promise. So we don't know yet. My gut feeling as a parent is, I don't want my kid to be first, essentially. Like, he only gets one education. I think we should take that responsibility really seriously. And so we need to proceed with cautious optimism. But because there's that gap in research time, that space is often filled by AI marketing. And I've been in quite a lot of these sort of conferences and roundtables with AI companies. Often their understanding of pedagogy and education isn't very good. And you see these clips online of going, look, it works amazingly with this one student, this thing. That's not the benchmark. The benchmark is, show me my struggling, disengaged students. What's going to be the cost or the benefit for them? If it works for them, I know it's going to work for everyone. Whereas if you're showing me it only works for students who are really motivated, who have loads of prior knowledge, whose parents really value education, that is not the benchmark. So at this stage, I want to be optimistic. I'm probably more on the cautiously worried side of things.
I think that's fair. I mean, when you see the research, there's nothing to give you the idea that it would be super optimistic when it comes to learning. And is there much around how, like, the bias and privilege and like the gap around AI exposing that gap even further?
Yeah. So this is the worry that people, when they talk about like novices versus experts. So when I use AI and ChatGPT as an example, Copilot, whichever large language model, when I do it about stuff that I know a lot about, I can spot the errors. And I can only spot those errors because I know a lot about those errors. Whereas if I was a novice, because it answers A, so convincingly, and B, it's almost quite sycophantic. It's like, what a brilliant question, Brad. I'm glad you asked me that. It's like, it's really easy to be like lulled into this false sense of security with this stuff. And so I think there is a worry that the gap will get bigger. We should talk about this sort of these errors. So I know they're called hallucinations. I was chatting to a friend who works in marketing, and he was saying one of the best things, the best marketing that's ever happened is, you know, when you're on the internet and you click, do you want to accept cookies? And I was like, yeah, I just want to get to the website, like allow all cookies. Calling them cookies has been one of the best things in marketing because everyone likes cookies, right? But if it was actually called what it was, like government level spyware, you'd go, oh, I don't know if I would like that. I think the same thing's happening with AI and hallucinations. By calling them hallucinations, it kind of sounds like
that's quite sweet.
Silly AI, yeah, it's quite sweet. Whereas if we actually called it what it was, like it is making stuff up.
Yeah, for just purely false information.
And bear in mind, we are in the profession of knowledge and accuracy and reliability, and that stuff matters. If I go to a library and I pick a book off the shelf, like page 37 is always going to have the same words on page 37. So we know that it's a reliable record. Hallucinations, if we're going to call them that, like they're not a bug. That they are a feature. They are built into the design of AI, and therefore, am I happy that my child might be exposed to that? Makes me a bit nervous.
Yeah, no, that's understandable.
Yeah.
And I think thirdly, so we've had mobile phones, AI.
Yeah.
I think the other big thing at the moment, education, is around behaviour.
Yeah.
And there's a debate there as well. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? How has the pandemic impacted behaviour?
Yeah.
And is it mobile phones that's impacted that? The internet? Like what is impacting behaviour? And what are some of the studies showing that you've looked into around behaviour in the classroom? Is it getting worse? And if so, how much is that to do with the pandemic and the world that our teenagers and kids live in at the moment?
See, I'm glad you asked me some of the easy questions to start with, because behaviour is like
It's massive.
It's massive. It's really controversial. You have some people on one argument who would say stuff like detentions should be banned because they're too authoritarian. You've got other people, mainly more teachers, who tend to go for the other argument, who say like they need behaviour management tools. And to get rid of some of that stuff would be really problematic. I don't know if we can say for sure what the causes are, because it is so multifaceted. From when we work with like thousands of schools, nearly all of them are saying they feel like something has changed post-pandemic. And I think that ripple effect will take some time. I think there's research around deterrents do help. We know incentives help. But the research that I find most interesting around behaviour is what can teachers do within their four walls, within their environment. That's really simple and easy. That can make a difference. So, for example, we know students tend to pay more attention and be less disruptive when they're sitting in rows. We know there's one study that found when teachers choose the seating plan, behaviour improves by 3 times.
Wow.
Right? So huge differences right there. The other area of research I really like around behaviour is this idea. It's called the Pygmalion effect. So to segue for 2 seconds, Pygmalion in Greek mythology was a sculptor, and he had such high expectations for his statue that these expectations turned into a real person. And it's the name coined by researchers to describe when teachers have high expectations of those students and maintain those high expectations, students tend to perform better. The opposite of the Pygmalion effect is known as the Golem effect. The Golem effect describes if you have low expectations, people tend to underperform and meet those low expectations, almost become self-fulfilling. And so if we start with the culture of expecting every student should behave, I'm going to support all students and at times use incentives and sometimes deterrents, but I'm not lowering my standards of what I expect, because the second I lower expectations, that's almost a guarantee that behaviour will reduce.
And when you spoke about the rows there, I feel like it's quite interesting thinking about the actual setup and layout of a classroom. If you're looking at a classroom from a learning science lens, what are some of the things that the research says is helpful and conducive to a positive learning environment?
So I want to slightly row back, if I may. The research on rows is really clear. Obviously, it depends on the age and stage of the students. So for much younger students, that might be really inappropriate for that age and stage. In terms of classroom design, there's been some research to look at, like, does highly decorated classrooms kind of distract students? There's some evidence that it does, probably not to a huge degree, but there is some indication. For me, I think once you start viewing stuff from a cognitive science lens, you start to think about stuff like cognitive overload. So what are the things that tend to overload people? 2 different areas within cognitive load theory I find quite interesting. One talks about transient information. So transient information is when I give you information and before you've had time to really grasp it, that information disappears. So for example, long verbal instructions. If I give you a long verbal instruction, by the time I get to the end, you're like, what
was the start?
Exactly. Especially for younger students whose working memory is probably smaller, or some students who have some learning challenges, that can be even more pronounced. So this then questions, how do we reduce transient information? Either we signal to students what the key information is. Maybe if there is long instructions, we have to have them written down or displayed somewhere. So I think that's an interesting starting point. The other area of cognitive load, we can talk about redundancy and the redundancy effect. And this describes how, because working memory is so small, I don't know for sure exactly what is the thing that you're focusing on. I know what I want you to be focusing on, but I can't be sure exactly what you are. And if I include some extra or irrelevant information, there's a chance that's the thing you're going to remember. So, for example, I once vividly remember when I used to teach in a college, I made a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire like PowerPoint because I knew I wanted to do quizzing essentially. I spent ages. I did all the animations. It was beautiful, and the students loved it. I'm pretty sure if you were to ask them what do they remember, they would say, "I remember all the animations."
The animation was great. The information,
but the content,
no idea.
And so we have to start with the content's the key part. And especially you mentioned earlier about how everyone's time poor. If we talk about PowerPoint design, I don't think enough people get trained on what makes a good PowerPoint. And yet people spend hours and hours making this stuff look beautiful. And I want to be confident that there's going to be a learning gain. Chances are excessive animations actually leads to a learning loss, not a learning gain. So starting to think about it through that lens allows you to go, well, what will save me time? What will be more efficient? What will be more effective? That they'll actually have headspace to mentally wrestle with the content.
And I guess one of the ways that memory and learning is tested is through homework.
Yeah.
And again, that's a hotly debated subject. People are like, do we just get rid of homework, especially in primary age? Like, is that even necessary? What does the research say around how that helps, improves memory and learning? Like, is it more of like just one of those things we've always done so we continue to do it, or is it genuinely helpful?
Yeah. So there's a teacher who I often is my go-to person when I talk about homework. Her name's Jo Castellino. She's written a book called The Homework Conundrum, which for me is like the gospel of homework. And it shows that it can have a really positive impact. It can be really valuable. One of the things I think she talks about is if you can link it to the lesson, as opposed to just seeing it as like a random isolated thing, that's going to be really beneficial. I think the type of homework matters. So like, I dread the thought of having to do paper mache stuff with my 7-year-old as part of his homework, because like, he's not going to remember anything about the Fire of London.
No.
He's just going to remember that we did some paper mache, which is a nice thing to do, but like, I'm rubbish at craft and like it takes ages.
And I feel like I would always get bored and then my dad would carry on in his evening doing paper mache.
And now there's another layer of this with AI, which can generate answers really, really quickly. So I think people do need to think about the homework culture and the type of homework. The amount of homework, the research suggests it's not as simple as more is better. There probably is a sweet spot somewhere. Who knows exactly what that sweet spot probably is. And so I think we can talk about the type of homework and the duration. Going back to AI and where I think it links really nicely with homework is all the research shows that we as adults are terrible at spotting AI-generated work, and AI detection technology is really terrible at spotting AI-generated work. I think the average is about 70% accuracy. And so therefore, we need to think carefully, if we can't detect if AI has done this work, what sort of homework are we setting, and how do I link that to the lesson to ensure that even if they are gaming the system, it's still going to accelerate their learning? I think the research shows it does have more impact in secondary than primary. That being said, a lot of focus on primary is encouraging students to read. So maybe if that is part of the homework, that's really, really valuable. And also it does probably help create some habits that are probably quite good. So yes, overall, I think it's a good thing. I certainly wouldn't encourage anyone to scrap it, but I just think has to be thought about quite critically. And no one research paper will tell you the answer. You need to read quite a bit of it.
And when we were speaking about mobile phones earlier, you said it would be one of your top 5 policies to ban mobile phones. Just out of interest, what would those, from the research and the learning, what you know, what would those 5 policies be if you were running a school?
God, that is a good question. I think I would be terribly placed to run a school. I think the work that head teachers do is getting so hard and complex. I don't envy any of them. If I was asked to come in from a kind of just from a cognitive science perspective, I think there needs to be more training on cognitive science and science of learning. I think it's getting much better, but I think we need to factor in much more training time because there is generally amazing research out there. I think thinking carefully about homework would probably be one. I think we are, certainly in England anyway, in the midst of a retention crisis. And I think we do have to think about workload and well-being, but I don't see that as separate to cognitive science. So, for example, if I'm giving you permission as your senior leader to go, you don't need to spend all hours creating these amazing classroom displays or amazingly or singing and dancing PowerPoint presentations, that's going to reduce workload, which hopefully should help. I sometimes think well-being is put as a afterthought. It's on the inset day, you can do a yoga class, or here's 1 hour to do, and it's just like, that's superficial. So I think more of an emphasis on cognitive science, banning phones, homework, well-being. If I had to go for a fifth one, I think probably, and this is getting better, so this isn't a criticism, because I do see improvements. I think all schools now really need to be focusing on students who have learning challenges and SEND. I feel like 10 or 15 years ago, it was the responsibility of like the SENCO, whereas now the level of challenge and the complexity that we're seeing seems to be increasing so much. I think it's everyone's responsibility. And generally speaking, if you look at good practice, obviously you get a large range within, like, not just even within SEND, but take ADHD. What will work for one ADHD student wouldn't work necessarily for another. But we generally know good practice for those students is probably going to be good practice for everyone. You're talking about clear explanations, scaffolding, modelling, quizzing, chunking material. That's just good teaching and learning. So by viewing it with that as the starting point, as opposed to what's the add-on that we can do for that, I think would probably be very high on my list.
And when it comes to SEND, there is a bit of a debate around, are people being overdiagnosed? Is that why we're seeing such an increase in our schools?
Yeah.
Is that true? Like, what does the research show you about the ways people are being diagnosed at the moment?
It's a really good question. And it's one that I think a lot about, mainly because my wife, she's a child psychologist who does diagnosis of things like autism and ADHD. So we have this discussion around the dinner table all the time. I don't think anyone can say there's an overdiagnosis, because that suggests we should know what the correct amount is. We can definitely say there's been an increase, and that's pretty clear to see. Now we can talk about why has there been an increase. One might speculate COVID accelerated certain things. We might say that actually it was underdiagnosed previously, and there was a bit of a taboo around diagnosis. You can't get away from some of the stats in terms of diagnosis levels tend to be significantly higher in private schools than they are in state schools. We could say that is the actual accurate amount, and it's because they've had access to resources. That means it gives a true diagnosis. Or some people might say it's an over diagnosis, and the state sector is the accurate amount, and maybe you have a percentage of parents who are pushing for certain things. I find that argument a bit weak, to be honest. Having seen firsthand what some families have to go through to get stuff like an EHCP, it is an incredibly tough and traumatic process for many people. Now, that's different from being on like the SEND register. But I think regardless of why, we know there's an increase, and therefore we have an obligation that every child who comes into our care and into our schools should be able to receive the best education. The big elephant in the room is funding. Certain schools and councils simply haven't got the funding. And over the previous years, things like CAMS, if we look at, has been decimated. So of course we're going to see more high-profile cases because the support structure that those students need has been taken away. I am hopeful that things will get better in the next few years, but I guess we have to wait
and see on that one. And one of the biggest things that people speak around in increasing the disadvantage gap and what is fair in schools is exams.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that has been a tradition through education, I'm sure as long as anyone can remember, is you get to the end of the year, have an exam in year 11, then you go to college, you have your exams, then you go to uni and you have your exams. And the exam culture in the UK especially is a big part of our education system. What does the research tell you around what is fair and what is the best way to test people? Is it coursework? Is it project-led things? Or is it sitting an exam at the end of a year?
Yeah. Okay, so I was kind of wondering how I was going to answer that when you're talking. So I was going, shall I go for like the sensible answer, or shall I be like the brutally honest answer?
Brutally honest.
Okay,
Ooh, Hayes.
here's the brutally honest answer. I think coursework now has pretty much little to no value as an assessment. I had issues with it beforehand, and I'll explain why I think that's multiplied now. So let's talk about the issues with it originally. The whole point of an assessment is, does it reliably reflect your work and your current abilities? That's pretty much why we do an assessment, right? And in order to get that accurate, we need to remove as many biases as possible. So if you take exams, what biases do exams remove? The questions are externally set. So that's one layer of bias that's been removed. The teacher can't give certain students questions that they know they'll just do good at. They're anonymously marked, and they're externally marked as well. So externally set, externally marked, and anonymous reduces a lot of biases. Those biases are there often in coursework. They're internally set, they're internally marked, and we should acknowledge, if you come from a family of privilege, you can get someone, if they're not too ethical, to either do it for you, or at the very least, assist you a lot to do it. And so we see there's a vast difference between these two things. If we look at teacher assessed grades, I mean, we don't really need the research. We had a live experiment of this in this country just a few years ago during COVID. If you look at which schools and which students did better during teacher assessed grades, it wasn't those from disadvantaged backgrounds. There was definitely a certain profile of school whose marks went up compared to other schools, and it wasn't the disadvantaged areas. So I've always felt that, for me, exams are the most fair of all the unfair systems.
Yeah.
Like, they have their issues as well.
Yeah.
So I'm not like saying they're brilliant, but I think they're the best of our bad options. Why I think this is now absolutely magnified is because of AI. Any written work that hasn't been supervised is not a reliable measure of someone's ability or thoughts because of AI. And so therefore, I think it's actually quite ironic, because everyone talks about 21st century skills.
Yeah.
It's 21st century tech in AI that's actually going to make us go back to more old school exam assessments. Now, I hear some people go, oh, but there's other forms of assessments, for example, a viva or an oral conversation. The big challenge with that is, A, accuracy. I think you tend to see from the research more variation in terms of the marks awarded on oral versus written work. And B, it's just scale. How do you do it at time? Because I know Viva takes ages. Maybe AI might end up being the answer to that. Students have to present their work and AI algorithms can mark it. But for now, I would certainly think exams are absolutely our best bet of seeing a reflection of your actual thoughts compared to coursework.
And if we were recording this podcast in 10 years' time, I mean, we know how much has changed in the last couple of years. But if we were doing it in 10 years' time, what would you hope would have changed around cognitive science and the understanding in schools? And what do you think is something that will be like, I can't believe that's ended up being the way it has?
So the honest answer is I don't know. And I think about this a lot, mainly because I mentioned earlier, I've got young kids. So I often think about, like, in 10 years' time, they'll be doing their GCSE and A levels. So what will their classroom look like? What will education look like? What things will we as a society value? Because of stuff like AI, I really don't know. And the truth is, no one knows. Anyone who says they do know is either lying or trying to sell you something, probably. So we don't know. And because we don't know, you kind of go, well, what's going to be our best bet now? And fundamentally, our best bet now is going to be probably the people who can interact with AI really well, and people who have a lot of knowledge so that they can skillfully navigate it. So I really like it that my kids still do their times tables, even though we have calculators. Because we as a society have said that's the building block of understanding numeracy. And I like it that they still do handwriting, because we know that's the fundamental parts of literacy. So I don't think we need to rush to change stuff now, because in such uncertainty, you go for what's going to be the most fundamentals. And the fundamentals are still building knowledge. What I think it might look like in 10 years, technology is clearly going to play a huge role. In terms of cognitive science, our brains aren't going to change that much in 10 years. Like retrieval practice will still be better than rereading and highlighting. Interleaving will be better than blocking. Spacing will be better than cramming. That's not going to change. The question is just how do we utilize that? And because we don't know, I don't think we can make too many bold predictions. What we do know for sure is it will be different. I think it's just really hard to know how.
We're going to have to replay this in 10 years' time and see when we're flying in our cars.
It's funny because I don't even like listening to myself back the next day on recordings. The thought of 10 years' time, not only hearing my voice, but also my terrible ideas.
Like, what was I thinking?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But also, just on that note, if I may, that's one of the beautiful parts of being evidence-informed. So I look at some of the stuff I thought 10 years ago, and there's some stuff I was like, yeah, I'm pretty happy that's why. And there's some stuff I've definitely changed my mind on because new research has emerged. And by being evidence-informed, it almost gives yourself permission to be flexible because as the research improves and our understanding increases, our opinions can change.
Yeah.
And so it means you don't have to be tied down by dogma. You can basically go where the evidence points you to. So hopefully our minds will change in 10 years, and that'll be a really good thing because it means we'll have learned more about teaching and learning.
And we like to finish the podcast with a quick fire round of 4 questions. Okay. So here we go. So first question, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing the education sector right now?
Funding. I think there is a lot of good stuff out there and education just needs to be better funded, basically.
Second question, what motivates you on difficult days?
Oh, good question. When we get the feedback from schools who are really embracing cognitive science and they're saying how it's reignited their passion for education and more importantly, transforming the lives of their students and the rate of improvements their students are making, it reminds you that this is probably the most important thing as a society we can do. And the thought of trying to change lives and help people get better is what keeps us going at InnerDrive.
And third question, what has been your proudest achievement in your career so far?
Oh, good question. From the sports side of things, I think from there, seeing an athlete you work with, win a medal at the games was pretty special. In terms of education, I guess our proudest achievement is we're at the stage now, I think, within InnerDrive where people trust what we say. They trust us as a reliable source of information. And that credibility has been hard won. I think some people fly in and out of education. And actually being seen as someone who's reliable and hopefully trustworthy and a source of valuable information. We're really proud of that.
And final question, what are you most looking forward to the rest of this academic year?
Our training is, we do a lot of stuff through our academy, which is our online portal, and it's worldwide. And seeing the expansion of that and teachers from a range of different communities and countries really embracing cognitive science, we're really excited to see how that grows in the next few months.
That sounds super exciting. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like I've learned so much. I'm going to leave here and be like, throw my phone in the bin, know how to read my Kindle properly.
Then my work here is done.
Yeah, but thank you so much. I mean, there's so much to take away for our listeners. I really appreciate you coming in.
Oh, thank you for having me on the pod. It's been a joy.